applause for that. Yeah. I guarantee this is the best music in town tonight. I'm coming down here. Are you guys okay with that? I'm like 40 feet away from you if I stand back there, so I'm not going to do that tonight. Merry Christmas, everybody. Merry Christmas. Did you get everything you wanted? No. Some people are like, yeah, there's some boys back there going, My guess is that some of you got what you wanted. Some of you didn't really want much, so it's super easy. Some of you have everything, so there's nothing we can get you anyway, right? And some of you maybe ended up just a little disappointed, right? I had Christmases certainly where I thought maybe something was going to happen in my life, and then it didn't. So there are Christmases times like that. Usually when you find yourself disappointed, it's something like you didn't get a gift that you were expecting to get, or maybe you were hoping to connect or reconnect with a family member in some way, or you found that distance and past wounds still existed when you thought you were going to have this lovely, joyous occasion. For me, I miss my mom at Christmas. She died right before Christmas a couple of years ago, and so every Christmas, I just can't quite get all the way there like I used to, and I think that that's a common experience when people experience grief, right? This is a really emotional time of year, right? It's full of high highs and low lows. And then this weekend, we're stuck between Christmas and New Year's, right? Your body, I think, doesn't quite know how to handle it. I mean, it's holidays, but then you're working, and then it's holidays, but the school is out, so then you're all thrown off your game. My dad says that retirement is exactly the same way, right? So I have not really known what day of the week it was, and my kids' schedules are all messed up. But here tonight, we are going to start a new worship series that I told you about earlier. It's called I Want to Believe But. And we're going to spend these next couple of weeks really picking at doubts and unbelief and some of the expectations that we put in the way or we put on God, and we lose the meaning of our faith. I'm going to start tonight with a story. And it's about a guy named Admiral Stockdale. Here's the picture. Oh, doesn't he look dapper in that? So Jim Stockdale was a United States military officer that was held captive for 8 years during Vietnam War. And he was held as a prisoner of war and tortured over 20 times by his captors. And he never had much reason to believe that he would survive the prison camp. And he thought he would never see his wife again. And the pains in which he endured, both physically and emotionally, brought him closer and closer to death as he lived there. But in 1973, he was released from his POW camp with his shoulders dislocated and his back fully broken. And in a business book written around the year 2000 called Good to Great, the author Jim Collins writes about this conversation he had with Admiral Stockdale about how he coped with living in the POW camp. And so Stockdale, he said something interesting. He said this. He said, "I never lost faith in the end of the story. I believed that I would get out and that I would also prevail in the end and turn the experience into something that defined my life." When Collins asked who didn't then make it out of Vietnam, Admiral Stockdale replied, he goes, "That's easy. It was the optimists. The ones who said things like, hey, we're going to get out by Christmas. And then Christmas would come and go. And then they would say, hey, we're going to get out by Easter. And then Easter would come and it would go. And then it would be Thanksgiving. And eventually they would die from a broken heart." Stockdale then added, "This is an important lesson. You must never confuse the faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can't afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the facts that are your current reality, whatever they may be." And since this quote in the book has been called the Stockdale paradox, right? And we'll put it up here. It's 2 steps. Number 1, have faith that you will prevail in the end. And number 2, confront your current reality. And I want us to do this together tonight. We're going to start first with number 2. I don't know, we're just going to mix it up, okay? And so we're going to boldly confront our current reality, things that seem to trip us up and cause us to stumble in believing in God in today's society. And then we're going to go back to number 1, and we're going to have faith that we will prevail in the end. So here's the truth tonight, folks. American Christianity is on the decline, especially in younger generations. Here is a map that you can sort of see. If you see the only rising category there, it is called no religion. right? The thought is that young adults would go off to college, like my own children, and then they'd kind of mess around, but then they get married and come back to the church. And this used to be how it was. But today, that is no longer the case. And it's not that they're converting to another religion or anything like that, or they're learning another spiritual practice. The reality is that most young people today are abandoning faith entirely. They aren't believing in God the same way that previous generations did. And studies show that by the year 2042, just 22 years from where we stand tonight, there will be more people who are not affiliated with any religious group than are affiliated with a religious group. That's amazing if you think about it. And there are a number of reasons why this is such a rapid increase. I'm going to show you a picture of my parents on their wedding day. Oh my gosh, are they cute, right? 70s, that's totally a 70s wedding, right? So this is my picture of my parents on their wedding day. And my mom and dad met in 1967. And they dated for 7 years before they got married. And the reason was because of their religion. You see, my parents had what they called, in their own words, a mixed marriage, right? My mom was Catholic, and my dad was Lutheran, right? So they couldn't reconcile this until 7 years later, and it caused this great conflict in their dating life. And finally, they decided that they should just get married, and they had to do it at Augustana College because it was the only place in town that would allow both a priest and a pastor to do the ceremony. Fascinating, right? This seems funny to me now, but then it was the reality. And if we look at people today, we have more friends of different nationalities and different religions than ever before in the history of humanity. My children's best friends and roommates come from all over the world with diverse experiences and different religious practices. And if we're honest, I think that this is beautiful and wonderful, this increased globalism, this chance that we have to experience the broadness of humanity, to look at God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit and then wonder if it's all true. But if we want to be honest on top of it, I think that the church hasn't done a very good job about talking about doubting or struggling with your faith. It seems to be kind of this unspoken thing, like if we don't talk about it, then it doesn't exist. Or maybe once a year we'll bring up doubting Thomas from the scriptures and we'll mention him sort of casually, but he comes back to Jesus anyway. But I think what we're lacking is a really honest conversation. And this is what I want us to confront our reality and do this together. So honestly, how many of you here have ever struggled or doubted with your faith in God? Right. I think it comes with the territory of belief, because if we're honest about belief, belief is really, really vulnerable. And we don't like to be vulnerable, do we? We don't like to do that. Instead, we protect ourselves and we insulate ourselves from what's coming next. And this really personal, this faith thing, so it drags up all of our fear and it drags up all of our insecurity. You mean, there's this God in the world who wants to be part of my life personally, but I can't see him, and I can talk to him, and he hears me. I mean, this is pretty vulnerable, right? I mean, I personally have never seen a burning bush. Anyone? No, nobody's ever seen a burning bush. And I have never heard voices from heaven speaking to me clearly. And if I profess my doubt and my struggle with unbelief, then maybe I don't have to get my hopes up. Then maybe I can prepare myself just a little bit more to live in this world that I have created of my own circumstances. And I can put up this level of protection that is not so vulnerable. And let's be honest, there are some more folks out there that have made this unbelief thing darn right terrifying. Ryan, my husband, and I drove to the cities yesterday just to celebrate Christmas with his family and then come back. And on the interstate, there's this great big billboard that says, heaven or hell? And it has fire and clouds and a 1-800 number you should call to figure it out. I mean, that is downright scary stuff, right? I mean, if I don't know what to believe then heaven or hell? I mean, that terrifies me. That's frightening and vulnerable. What if I don't have all the answers about my faith? What about that? What if somebody asks me a question about what I believe and I don't know the answer? That's scary. And it's scary enough to just say, I'm just not going to believe. I'm just not going to do it instead of standing in a vulnerable place of belief. Now, I know that Pastor Hans has shared his story of being divorced, but I'll let you in on a secret. I am divorced too. Yep, you guys hired 2 divorced pastors. Good for you. And anyone who has gone through a divorce knows how deeply, deeply painful it is. And I can remember feeling so broken and so damaged from the loss of my marriage. And I had prayed so hard, fervently, on my knees, on my bed, for my marriage to work, for my husband to stay with me and my kids so that they would have a stable home and not have to go back and forth. And at that time, I was working in the church, and the church itself was growing, so I bargained with God. I said, God, I promise to just work really hard in the church if you save my marriage. But that didn't happen. And I was left a 25-year-old single mom with 2 kids, feeling wildly, wildly unworthy of love. And after some time, a couple of years, when the wounds of my divorce started healing their way up, I started to picture what my dream husband might look like. And I'll confess to you all tonight that Ryan Larson, the man I'm married to, is not my dream husband. Yeah, he already knows this, so we're okay. In my mind, at this time, it's true. If I was ever going to date again, it would be when my children were older, right? And I have them under control. And I would get married to my dream husband, and he would really, really love me. He would love me so much. He'd want to provide for me and take me places, and he'd pay the bills because I'm in ministry, and that's a struggle. But, it's true. And he would just love things. He would fix the cars and fix the broken things in the house. And I would like him, right? I would like him just enough to let him love me, right? Because I didn't want to open up my heart again to being hurt, right? I didn't want to do that. I wanted to keep it guarded and locked up and totally impenetrable. And this sounds like a good plan, right? Well, clearly you know how that worked out. But this is why I figured that if I had this life with this dream husband, I could keep myself at arm's distance of having any possibility of having my heart broken again. I could keep up this wall of protection that would keep me from the pain that I had experienced in the past, because I didn't want to hurt like that again, and that I would never have to be vulnerable again, right? Abraham in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, he had a good plan too. And we're going to look at that this evening. Around 2,000 years before Jesus, this man Abraham was around. And Abraham had this wonderful young encounter with God, where he felt and experienced the presence of God. And God at that time promised him 3 things. He promised him land and descendants and blessings. So Abraham's like, let's do it. Let's go on this journey. So Abraham goes off onto this journey. He leaves his homeland with his wife Sarai, and they go out. And first thing God presents them with is land, right? Here's God fulfilling God's promise. But then, as they're living in that land, they're getting older, and they still don't have any children. And they start to get frustrated with this. And no doubt that God will keep God's promises to them, because you see, God promised children, and it hasn't worked out for them. So they prayed, and they prayed for children. But still, Sarai doesn't get pregnant. And both Abraham and Sarai start to not believe that God is going to do what God promised all those years ago. So Sarai, she is just going to get it done herself. I mean, I admit, she's a lot like me. So she has this servant, Hagar, and she decides that Hagar is going to be a surrogate for her and Abraham. And Abraham will make a child for both of them through her. And so he does that. And a child is conceived, and Sarai, in her pain, is not decreased by the birth of this baby. Instead, her pain is increased. To watch the belly of her servant grow, and to look at Hagar, and eventually look at her son Ishmael, it's just too heartbreaking for Sarai. You see, the boy and her barrenness just stares at her in the face, and it's just too vulnerable. So she asks her husband, Abraham, she says, "Send Hagar and Ishmael away." And so he pauses and he prays to God. And this is where we're going to pick up today's readings. You can follow along in your bulletin or on the screens. So God also said to Abraham, "As for Sarai, your wife, you will no longer call her Sarai, but her name will be Sarah. And I will bless her, and I will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come to her." And Abraham fell face down, and he said it with me. Let's do that for a second. Come on. I mean, this is a big chortle, right? He's like laughing, right? And he says to himself, "Will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Are you kidding me? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? And Abraham said to God, No, give Ishmael so he might live under the blessing." And God said, "Yes, but your wife, Sarah, she will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him, and as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you, and I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful and greatly increase his numbers, and he will be the father of 12 rulers, and I will make him into a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you by this time next year." And this is what happens. This 90-year-old woman, she has a baby, right? God keeps his promise that he made so long ago. But let's talk a little bit about Abraham. Abraham laughs at God. He doubts so openly about what God is saying to him that he chuckles out his objection. "We are too old. Why don't you just bless the kid I already have?" He does not believe that God will do what God has promised. And he doesn't believe, and he has doubts. Because to have a child at 100 years old would surely be unbelievable. And for Abraham, it would be just far too vulnerable for him and Sarah to go through. And here's what I hope that you can hear from this reading, is that God here isn't remotely bothered by Abraham's doubts. And in the same way, my friends, God isn't remotely bothered by your doubts, by your wrestling. God knows how vulnerable it is to trust in him. God knows how vulnerable it is to let yourself be open and loved and treasured. God knows that we have a hard time with it, and we struggle with keeping each other's promises. But you see, God doesn't struggle with keeping promises because God is always faithful. God knows that it's vulnerable to receive love, and it doesn't seem to bother him one bit if you doubt it. So God just lets Abraham sit there with all this unresolved doubt, and what he does is he just reassures him that he's still going to bless him, that he's still going to walk with him, and he's still going to be with Sarah. God's still going to make Abraham have children. And in fact, he's still going to bless the one that he went ahead and made on his own too, right? God loves him so much that he isn't even slightly upset by his doubts. I like the quote from author Anne Lamott when she says, the opposite of faith is not doubt, but certainty. Certainty is missing the point altogether. Faith notices the mess, the emptiness, the discomfort, and it just lets it hang there and be there. Because friends, faith is vulnerable. Belief is vulnerable. Giving and receiving like we do at Christmas is vulnerable. It's about not having all the right answers and not pretending to have so. It's not about having your spiritual stuff all wrapped up in a perfect package so that you can defend it when you present it to other people. It's not about perfection to appease some sky-high deity with your actions and choices in this life. You see, faith, belief, It's not about certainty. It's about love. C.S. Lewis writes, to love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything with your heart and it will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to be sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one, not even an animal. Instead, wrap it carefully around with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid entanglements with other people. Lock it up safe in a casket or coffin of your own selfishness. But in that casket, safe and dark and motionless, it'll change. Your heart will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable, because to love at all is to be vulnerable. You see, God didn't save my first marriage or give me my dream husband who I could keep at a distance. Instead, he gave me Ryan Larson, who, if I'm honest, could completely destroy me if he wanted to. He could wreck me. And that is so much better than anything I could have ever dreamt. He's not perfect, but he's perfect for me. And I cannot help but love him back in that vulnerability. You see, friends, God is so much bigger than your doubt, that when you doubt, it doesn't even faze him, because God's love and God's grace are always reaching out towards us. You see, I think when we get this, when we understand this, then it frees us up to talk about life and love and God openly and without hesitation and without having to have all the answers and without having to be right about everything. Instead, we get to laugh at what God is doing like Abraham. We get to wrestle with deep grief and sadness when they come our way. We get to wonder why we feel lost and alone sometimes. We get to be skeptical and use our minds to keep asking questions and wondering. And we get to love. We get to love ourselves and we get to deeply love others. And if we're honest and we're confronting our reality tonight, in our American society, where belief in God is rapidly declining, there are other things that are rapidly on the rise. You see, we have the most lonely, obese, medicated, indebted, and addicted adult population that has existed in the history of time. So friends, let's doubt together. Let's not have answers together. Let's walk together instead, and let's laugh at what God's doing, and let's be vulnerable and open together, because we know in the truth that in the end, God will prevail, because God always does, because God always loves you, because God is bigger than your doubt. Please pray with me. God, you are always, always faithful. And when we don't understand what's going on in the world, you walk with us, and you're not even fazed by our unbelief. Like those before us, we cry out when we doubt, Lord, we believe. Help our unbelief. Amen.